I think so.
Very good. Hello, everybody. I'm Perera, the composer of Why I Wake Early, and I've been invited to talk a little bit about the piece and share some time with you before the concert. You probably didn't know that you were in for a Hollywood production tonight. Steven Spielberg is coming at the moment. And the reason for the videotaping is that the members of the chorus who are warming up wanted to hear these remarks, and so the taping is for their benefit. First of all, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Not very well.
What?
Not very well.
Not very well. I'll try to speak up as loud as I can without... Is that a little better? Okay. There are microphones here, but they don't appear to be turned on. Let me see. Hello? Hello? Okay. I'll do the best I can. I'm going to tell you something tonight about Why I Wake Early, how it came to be written, about the choice of the Mary Oliver poems as the text, and about my interpretation of that poetry. And finally, I'm going to point out some things to listen to in the music. And after that, I hope we'll have some time for some questions. We're an intimate enough group that should be fun and should be easy to do. In 2005, I received a commission from two choral organizations for a new work to be premiered by each of them independently in the 2007-2008 season. And the two choruses were the Chatham Chorale of Cape Cod and the New Amsterdam Singers of New York City. Both choruses had already performed other pieces of mine, and their conductors were well known to me. The occasion for the commission was that both conductors were celebrating significant anniversaries with their choruses. 20 years for Margaret Bossy with the Chatham Chorale, and 40 years for Clara Longstreth and the New Amsterdam Singers. The commission was originally for a work of about 20 minutes for mixed chorus, that is men and women's voices, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, with an accompaniment by string quartet. Each chorus had in mind a collaboration with a particular quartet, though only one of those worked out in the end, and that was the New Amsterdam Singers with the Lark Quartet in New York. But I felt that 4 solo strings alone would be too light to support a large chorus. So I requested that the accompaniment include piano, and that was agreed to. I composed the music in 2006, and the piece was premiered on Cape Cod by the Chatham Chorale in the fall of 2007, and in New York by the New Amsterdam Singers in the spring of 2008. Why I Wake Early has since been performed by other choruses, and tonight's performance will be its 11th, I believe. It has also been recorded by David Hodgkins, who is the conductor of the New England Classical Singers in tonight's concert, used with Boston's Coro Allegro on the Navona label. It's on a recording called Awakenings with Coro Allegro, available at fine stores everywhere, they used to say, but I would suggest starting with Amazon. The commission didn't specify a text, and I take the selection of text very seriously. I try to find poetry or prose that will have a special resonance for the singers who are going to be performing the piece. For example, in previous commissions that I had received from these two choruses, I had chosen for the Chatham Chorale Henry Beston's famous nature work, The Outermost House, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a journal of a year spent living alone on a beach in Eastham on Cape Cod. And for the New Amsterdam Singers, I had written The Golden Door, a cantata based on the recollections of immigrants who had passed through Ellis Island at the turn of the 20th century. In this case, it was Margaret Bossy, the conductor of the Chatham Chorale, who suggested that I look at the poetry of Mary Oliver, a poet who lived in Provincetown and who drew much inspiration from the natural world of Cape Cod. Now, I was not previously familiar with Mary Oliver's poetry, and so in the summer of 2005, I read all of it that I could get my hands on. And I found several poems, probably 17 or 18, that appealed to me very much as having a potential for a musical setting. And I'll say a few things later on about what I think makes certain texts better suited for use in music than others. But anyway, I had winnowed out of these many books of her poetry about 17 or 18 poems that had a great variety of imagery and mood, and that I felt could provide contrast and variety within a multi-movement choral work. And I submitted that list of poems to the two conductors who read the poems, gave me feedback. We love this, we can't stand that kind of thing. And then I narrowed my list down to about 10 poems, from which I intended to use 7 or 8. And I printed out the text of the poems, and I put them down on the floor of my studio, and I spent a lot of time sitting in a chair and moving them around on the floor, trying to see if I could achieve some kind of narrative flow through these poems, and an overarching design that would make a satisfying musical form. What would be a good opening poem? What would be a good closer? Which poem should follow which? As I studied what I had, and I think I had some inklings about this before, but when I really studied them, I felt that there was a particular order that suggested itself. And I was able to eliminate 2 or 3 from that 10 to bring it down to a final number of 8. Now, some of these poems clearly evoked a particular time of day. These included, oh, and I should ask you, does everyone here have a program that has okay, if you care to look as we talk about these poems, it might be helpful, because I'll be playing also some excerpts from the different pieces. Anyway, Morning at Great Pond seemed to me to be a great opener, but it was certainly a poem that specified a time of day, morning. Bats suggested a time of day, because when I think of bats, I think of twilight. And bats coming down and getting in your hair. White night, obviously, and Why I Wake Early would be a morning poem. And it seemed to me that Morning at Great Pond, which has its opening line, first words in the poem, it starts like this. Felt like a starter. Not a rocket science there. Why I Wake Early felt like a closing poem. It felt to me like something that would make a hymn or an anthem, a good closing piece. So I had then Morning at Great Pond and Why I Wake Early. I had essentially staked out or created a 24-hour cycle from one morning to the next morning, if you will. Now, the bats and White Night, because they're evening poem, one's an evening poem and one's a night poem, would then, within the context of that hypothetical cycle, be the 2 ones that would precede the end, the 6th and 7th of the 8 poems. And that left me with 4 other poems that were definitely daylight poems. They weren't, however, particularly specific as to the time of day, but they had to do with going out and observing nature in the daylight. It was clear that these were not things happening at twilight or before first light or night. Not only was the time of day not specified, but the span of time that the poem covered wasn't clear. For example, Summer Poem feels somewhat open-ended to me, and it starts with the poet leaving her house and going out to observe the flora and fauna around a pond, and getting almost hypnotized by watching a white heron fishing in the pond and taking these very, very slow steps. The piece actually slows down in its speed as the poet muses on the heron making its own poem as it walks through the water. So that could take quite a bit of time. But a poem like I Looked Up happens in an instant. It's about a moment of observation. She looks up, she sees an extraordinary bird, and the bird rises and flies away. It's a very short amount of time. So I chose Summer Poem to be the second movement because, again, of this evocation of the day's routine. leaving the house, I set out to see the frog, for example, as the day begins. And then she goes on to observe other things. And it lasts into a long, windless afternoon, quote unquote. So I had the first two poems. I took Entering the Kingdom for my third movement. This is the one begins with the words, "The crows see me." And it is a fascinating poem about this particular poet's attempt to enter nature, to merge herself in a way with the natural world so that there would be no division between being a human being and being a creature, another creature. And I took this poem to be actually my third movement because it suggested midday to me. It didn't refer specifically to noon or midday, but it has a dreamlike reverie of, quote unquote, lying down by a slow river and learning something by being nothing a little while, but the rich lens of attention. There's sort of dreamlike reverie. Now the cycle of pieces, had my three poems, demanded something that was different. And that felt to me as if it should be something fast-paced and dramatic. And Rain in Ohio felt like the logical choice for the fourth movement. And to emphasize the contrast, this poem is set for men's voices alone. So we've had sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses for the first three. Now we have just the men divided into three parts. And they sing against a very, very driving rhythmic ostinato. Just illustrated the piano in a minute, but something that has a lot of propulsion to it. I was also conscious in this poem that the events that were being described, which were the gradual buildup of thunderclouds leading to a thunderstorm, were weather conditions that would be typical of the later afternoon hours, typically occur in the afternoon. The remaining daytime poem was I Looked Up, the revelation of the bird rising from the pine trees, its wings enormous and opulent, and the bird seemingly wreathed in fire. And this poem I also consigned to the late afternoon of my hypothetical 24-hour cycle. It became the fifth movement. And then came Bats, number 6, White Night, number 7, and Why Awake Early, number 8. Okay, now I had my final set of 8 poems, and I had them in the order that seemed to make sense to me and that provided the contrast that I wanted between movements and within movements. So I began the actual composition of the music now going back to the first poem and working from number 1 through number 8. Not darting around all through the cycle, but doing them in order. And these were not just to be 8 discrete pieces of music, but a cycle of pieces in which there would be some shared musical material across the movements, and in which the unity of the whole would be balanced by a variety of tempo and mood and compositional technique within the individual movements. 2 of the poems suggested setting for men's or women's voices alone, and I've already spoken about Rain in Ohio. But Bats, with its reference to the tropes of vampires and their mostly female victims, is set for 3-part women's voices, and in a tongue-in-cheek style, which makes reference to the musical conventions of the old-time horror movie. So, talking about vampires creeping in and out of bedrooms, and we got a little evocation of that kind of music that we all are familiar with in theater. Now, for me, the transition from one movement to another is very important. And I pay special attention to the junctures of movements. I play and replay the end of one piece and the beginning of the next. You know, is the new texture and tempo convincing? Does it feel right? Is there a change of key or pitch center? Does that feel right? And in this moment, I feel a little more, I think, like a film director joining one scene to the next one. There has to be a flow. One has to feel a logical, for ending one piece into the beginning of the next. And I actually feel how long those pauses ought to be from one movement to the next. Now, if you're doing a recording like this, I can specify to the recording engineer, stop. begin the next movement. We know exactly how many seconds it will have. But in live performance, of course, there are extra musical considerations. String players may have to put on mutes or take mutes off, or there might be a stand light that keeps falling off, and the guy has to put it up and adjust it. There's always something. Now, I did allude earlier to the question of why a poem might appeal to one composer and not to another. Why a poem might seem better suited for music than another. And for me, the most important thing that invites musical realization in poetry or prose is that it is allusive. Not elusive, although some poems are elusive, but allusive, meaning it indirectly mentions or suggests or refers to something else. So you have the literal and then you have a referent. In other words, it points to something beyond itself, beyond the literal words. And music is wonderful at claiming the space between the literal and the intangible. Mary Oliver's poetry is largely concerned with nature and our relationship with nature. And for me, just out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with some of the poetry of Mary Oliver? Okay, not a lot here. So you will have a treat in store for you. And I suggest if you can, when you go in tonight, read the poems through before they're sung. Anyway, for me, she represents an extension of, or certainly a kinship, with the New England transcendentalist tradition of Emerson and Thoreau, maybe the Alcotts. The transcendentalists sought truth revealed through nature. And they urged us to go out into nature, to observe it closely, and to listen to its teachings. Because you remember Thoreau's Walden going out and living in a little cabin on the edge of a pond, Walden Pond. Each of the poems that I've chosen for this cycle involves a specific kind of encounter with the natural world. And it evokes awe, or gratitude, or terror, or reverence. But it's always implying something that is beyond and unseen, something beyond the literal. And that, to me, is a quality that a text needs to be musicalized. There's a lot of wonderful poetry out there that's absolutely matter-of-fact and flat, and it doesn't set my imagination cooking at all. Everything that you need to know is right there. So I'm looking for poems that have something that hints at something beyond, something transcendent. So now what I'd like to do is go to the piano and play you some things that I'd suggest you might want to listen for in the piece. We'll take a look at each of the movements, to say a few things about each of the movements, and some overarching musical ideas that keep recurring in the piece and that you can listen for. And you might want to again follow on if you have the poems in front of you. So the piece starts with Morning at Great Pond, and the first words, as I've said, are, "It starts like this." And those 4 words are set to 4 pitches, softly sung by the choir. And I'm going to sing, I'm not a very good singer, you're going to enjoy them a lot more than you're going. It starts like this. Now there's quite a lot of information in those 4 notes from a composer's point of view. We start on a note, we go up a step, we go down to a step below the first note, we go up to a step higher than the last note. It's a kind of wedge, or zigzag. And the interval between the first note and the last note is a particular interval. Those of you who are musicians will know this is a tritone. In the Middle Ages, people called this the devil in music, because it was an unsatisfactory interval to rest on or end on. It demanded resolution. It had a sense of tension that had to be resolved. So that interval resolved out or So right away, it's kind of pregnant. It has a sense it has to go somewhere. And let's see, there's a, I don't know, it's being rolled around that. Now that little motive will occur either literally or in some variation many, many times. So you can kind of keep your ear tuned to the idea of the wedge or the zigzag musical figure. Now, from a composer's point of view, this resolution, that tension, can be resolved either by going, if we continue that movement out, we would resolve it. And we could keep going. And with these particular pitches, we could expand that out and it would form a musical scale. With those particular 4 pitches, we could get a scale of G or E minor. So it has the possibility of expanding out into a tonality, into a key, just from that little, go this way. Either of those 2 key centers. And those are quite important key centers in this piece. In fact, the E key center, the first movement ends on an E chord, and the piece as a whole ends on an E chord. So, you know, if we're talking about a piece by Mozart or Beethoven, we could say it's the Beethoven Mass in C or the Mozart Vespers in G or whatever. This piece, if it had a central pitch, it would be E. But it's not tonal in a conventional sense. It uses some familiar chords, but it goes a little beyond that. So one of the ways that wedge could expand is into a key center. Another way it could expand is to continue the motion of whole steps. Well, if we kept going with that, we would have something called a whole tone scale, which doesn't give a sense of traditional key. In fact, it's rather floating. It could go almost anywhere. And in fact, when we come to bats, that traditional horror music, movie music, you'll see that I draw on that quite a lot. Know, so the two things that the wedge can lead us to is to this harmony, whole tone scale, which gives rise to a particular chord called an augmented triad, the one I just played. All the intervals within it are equal. It has no center of gravity. It can float around and slither around anywhere. Now, in the second piece, Summer Poem, the accompaniment is kind of a hustle and bustle. It gives you the sense of a kind of purposeful start to the day, at least in my ear. And the accompaniment goes like this. And the singers sing, leading the house.